The phone rang at 6:47 on a Thursday evening in November, and Naomi Whitfield was in the living room of their Buckhead home in Atlanta, Georgia, reviewing a quarterly compliance report she had brought home from the office when she saw her husband's name on the screen and answered it. And the voice on the other end was not her husband's voice. It was a woman's voice, young and slightly breathless, and the woman said, "Is this Gerald Whitfield's wife?" And Naomi said yes, and the woman said, "Gerald collapsed at the hotel this afternoon, and he is at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital, and he asked me to call you." And Naomi set down the document she was holding and said, "He asked you to call me." And the woman said yes, and Naomi said, "And who are you?" And the woman was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I work at the hotel." And Naomi said, "I see." And the woman said, "He is stable, but the doctors want him to stay overnight for observation." And Naomi said, "Thank you for letting me know." And she ended the call, and she set the compliance report on the coffee table, and she sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. And in those 4 minutes, she did not cry, and she did not call anyone, and she did not move from where she was sitting. She simply sat with the specific stillness of someone who has just received confirmation of something they already knew and is taking the time to let the confirmation settle into the shape it was always going to take. Then she stood up, and she picked up her keys and her coat, and she drove to Piedmont Atlanta Hospital, not because she did not understand what a young woman calling from her husband's phone at 6:47 on a Thursday evening meant. She understood exactly what it meant, but because Gerald was her husband and he was in a hospital, and that was where she was supposed to be, and Naomi Whitfield had spent 14 years being exactly where she was supposed to be, and she was not going to stop on a Thursday evening in November. Stay with me, because what Naomi already knew when she walked through the doors of Piedmont Atlanta Hospital that evening, and what she had been quietly doing about it for the previous 8 months, is the part of this story that nobody who knew Gerald Whitfield saw coming. And the ending of this story is not a confrontation, and it is not a public exposure, and it is not a dramatic scene in a hospital corridor. What it is something quieter and more permanent than any of those things, and it begins with the specific moment Naomi set down her compliance report and sat very still for 4 minutes before she stood up and picked up her keys. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now if you have not already, because we tell the stories on this channel that nobody else is telling, and this community is growing every single day. Drop your location in the comments right now and tell us. If your husband collapsed and a woman you did not know called you from his phone, what would your first move be? We read every single comment, and we want to hear from you before this story is over. Atlanta, Georgia, 2009. Naomi Whitfield was 30 years old when she married Gerald Whitfield at a venue in Midtown Atlanta on a warm May evening when the city was at its most beautiful, and every person in that room believed they were watching a marriage that was going to last, because the two people at the center of it looked like people who had made a considered decision rather than people who had been swept into something by circumstances or momentum. Naomi had met Gerald 3 years earlier at an Atlanta professional networking event, and had spent those 3 years watching him with the same careful attention she applied to everything before she decided it was trustworthy. She was a corporate compliance officer at a mid-sized Atlanta financial services firm, and she had the specific kind of intelligence that expressed itself most clearly through pattern recognition. She was the person her colleagues called when something in a set of documents did not feel right, not because she was the most aggressive or the most vocal person in any room, but because she had the specific gift of noticing when something that was supposed to add up did not add up, and being willing to say so clearly and without drama. She had grown up in Decatur with her mother Iris, a retired Atlanta schoolteacher who had raised Naomi alone after Naomi's father left when Naomi was 9 years old. And Iris had told her daughter from the time she was old enough to understand it that the most important thing a woman could develop was the ability to see clearly without letting what she hoped to see interfere with what was actually there. Naomi had taken that instruction seriously in every part of her life, including the 3 years she spent watching Gerald before she decided he was someone she could build something with. She had seen his charm and had assessed it carefully and had decided that it was genuine and that it was manageable and that the man beneath it was worth the marriage she was agreeing to. She had been right about that for 11 years. And then she had begun, slowly and without drama, to be wrong about it. Gerald Whitfield was 34 when they married, the general manager of one of Atlanta's most prestigious boutique hotels in the Midtown neighborhood. a position he had built over a decade of work in the hospitality industry on the specific foundation of making every single person who walked through his doors feel like the most important person present. He was charming and attentive and warm in the specific professional way of the best hotel managers, the kind of warmth that has been practiced so long and so consistently that it becomes indistinguishable from the genuine article. And Naomi had understood from early in their relationship that Gerald's charm was not a performance he turned on and off, but a quality that had become so deeply embedded in how he moved through the world that he was no longer fully aware of when he was deploying it, and when he was simply being himself. She had decided this was something she could live with as long as it was directed appropriately. And for the first 11 years of their marriage it was. Gerald was present and attentive and warm at home the way he was present and attentive and warm everywhere else, and Naomi had no reason to believe that the warmth he brought home was less genuine than the warmth he offered his guests. They built a life together in Atlanta that reflected both of their specific capacities, Naomi's precision and Gerald's warmth. They bought a home in Buckhead in 2015. They had a circle of friends that included people from both of their professional worlds. They traveled once a year to somewhere that Gerald chose because he knew the hospitality industry and always found extraordinary places that Naomi would not have found on her own. They were, by every observable measure, a successful Atlanta couple in the specific way that two capable people with complementary strengths can be successful together when they are both fully committed to the same life. And then something changed, and Naomi noticed the change the way she noticed everything before she was ready to name it. The first sign had not been dramatic. It never is in the cases that matter most. It had been a change in patterns so subtle that most people would not have registered it as significant. Gerald had always been the kind of husband who called when he was going to be late, and who was present in the specific way that busy men can be present when they have decided that being present matters. And somewhere around 3 years before the Thursday evening in November, that presence had begun to acquire a quality of performance that it had not had before. He was still calling when he was going to be late, but the calls had become slightly more detailed in their explanations than the situation seemed to require. The kind of detail that innocent people do not offer, because innocent people do not feel the need to preemptively explain themselves. He was still coming home at reasonable hours, but he had developed the specific, careful normalcy of someone who had rehearsed the transition between wherever he had been and wherever he was now. There was also the matter of his phone, which had always sat on the kitchen counter or the bedside table with the ease of someone who had nothing to manage, and which had gradually migrated into his pocket and his jacket, and the specific proximity of his hand in a way that communicated management rather than convenience. And there were the evenings when he came home and was warm and present and attentive in the way he had always been, but with a quality of effort to it that had not been there before. The effort of someone performing a version of themselves rather than simply being themselves. Naomi had noticed all of this the way she noticed everything, quietly, and without immediately naming it. She had filed it in the same careful part of her mind where she filed everything she was not yet ready to act on, and she had continued to be exactly the wife she had always been while she waited for the pattern to complete itself into something she could see clearly enough to address. The pattern completed itself on a Friday morning in March, 8 months before the Thursday evening in November, when Naomi was reviewing their joint credit card statement. With the same routine attention she gave their household finances every month, and found a charge she did not recognize at an upscale Midtown Atlanta restaurant on a Wednesday evening, when Gerald had told her he was at a hotel industry networking event in Sandy Springs. It was not a large charge, it was dinner for two a day. Restaurant that was not the kind of place you took a professional contact to discuss industry trends. It was the kind of place you went when you wanted the evening to feel like something it was not supposed to be. Naomi looked at that charge for a long time. She looked at it with the specific focused attention she brought to every discrepancy she found professionally. The attention of someone who understands that a single piece of information that does not fit the pattern it is supposed to fit is not an anomaly. It is an entry point. Then she opened her laptop, and she did what she did professionally every single day, which was to follow the trail from the entry point and see where it led and document what she found along the way. What she found over the following 3 weeks confirmed what the pattern had been building toward for months, and gave it a name and a face, and a specific set of details that transformed it from a feeling she had been managing into a situation she needed to A dress with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything that mattered. Her name was Tiffany. She was 26 years old. She worked as an events coordinator at Gerald's hotel, a position she had held for approximately 18 months. She had a social media presence that was not set to private, and that contained. If you knew what you were looking at, and Naomi knew exactly what she was looking at. Sufficient information to understand the nature and the duration and the specific texture of what had been happening between them, and for how long it had been happening while Naomi was sitting across from Gerald at dinner and attending his hotel industry events as his wife, and building a life with a man who was simultaneously building something else entirely. Naomi looked at what she had found, and she sat with it for one full evening, and then the following morning she made 3 decisions. The first decision was that she was not going to say anything to Gerald yet. The second decision was that she was going to call an Atlanta family law attorney before she did anything else. And the third decision was that she was going to continue being exactly the wife she had always been until she understood the full picture of what she was actually dealing with, and had positioned herself appropriately within it. The attorney she called was a woman named Rochelle Foster, who had spent 20 years in Fulton County Family Court, and who had the specific professional composure of someone who has heard every variation of this situation and approaches each one with the same careful, systematic thoroughness regardless of how many times she has heard it before. Rochelle told Naomi 3 things in their first meeting. The first was that Georgia was an equitable distribution state, which meant that marital assets would be divided fairly in a divorce proceeding, and that 14 years of marriage with both parties contributing to the building of those assets was a significant factor in how equitable distribution would be calculated. The second was that documentation was everything, and that the more complete Naomi's picture of their marital finances was before anything was filed, the stronger her position would be in every subsequent conversation. And the third was that Naomi should continue living her completely normal life and making no changes to her behavior or her financial habits until Rochelle told her it was time to move. Naomi said she understood all 3 of those things completely. She went home that evening, and she made dinner, and she sat across from Gerald at their dining table, and she was warm and present and engaged, and exactly the wife he believed her to be. She asked him about the hotel, and he told her about a large corporate event his team was planning for December, and she asked appropriate questions and listened to his answers, and the specific quality of her attention was identical to the quality it had always been, and Gerald Whitfield sat across from his wife of 14 years and felt completely comfortable and had no idea that the woman across the table had spent the afternoon in Rochelle Foster's office in Midtown Atlanta and had already begun with the same quiet, systematic precision she applied to everything in her professional life to understand the full shape of what she was going to do about what she had found. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now, because this story is about to turn in a direction that Gerald Whitfield did not see coming, and you need to be here when it does. Tell us in the comments. Could you have sat across that dinner table for 8 months knowing what Naomi knew and said absolutely nothing while you built the complete picture? Because some of you could, and some of you could not, and we genuinely want to know which one you are. Over the following 8 months, Naomi built a complete picture of their marital finances with the specific professional efficiency of a corporate compliance officer who has been doing exactly this kind of work for 15 years and who has now turned that expertise on the most important set of documents she has ever been asked to examine. She documented every joint asset, every account, every property, every investment, the Buckhead home that they had purchased together in 2015 and whose current market value she had independently appraised, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, the savings accounts, the value of Gerald's professional position and its associated benefits, and the specific contribution that Naomi's income had made to every element of what they had built together over 14 years. She brought that documentation to Rochelle Foster in organized folders at their monthly meetings, and Rochelle looked at what Naomi brought and said at their third meeting that she had rarely seen a client arrive this prepared, and Naomi said, "This is what I do for a living," and Rochelle said, "I know, and that is exactly why your position in these proceedings is going to be very strong." During those 8 months, Naomi continued to be exactly the wife she had always been. She attended the hotel industry events that Gerald needed her to attend. She was warm and appropriate and present in every room she was required to be in alongside him. She smiled at the right moments and asked the right questions of the right people, and gave Gerald absolutely no reason to believe that anything in their household or their marriage had changed in any meaningful way. Gerald continued to feel comfortable. He continued to come home with his carefully performed normalcy and his detailed explanations for his occasional late evenings, and Naomi continued to receive all of it with the same measured warmth she had always offered him, and continued to file everything she observed in the careful part of her mind that was now also building the case that Rochelle Foster was preparing to deploy at the appropriate moment. There were evenings when she sat across from him at dinner, and he talked about the hotel and the events his team was managing and the guests who had stayed that week, and she listened and responded and asked appropriate follow-up questions, and the specific quality of her presence at that table was identical to what it had always been, and Gerald had no way of knowing that the woman listening to him with that familiar warmth had already been to Rochelle Foster's office 8 times, and had already assembled a picture of their marital estate that was more complete and more thoroughly documented than anything Gerald could have produced about his own finances if he had been asked to do. Then on a Thursday evening in November, Gerald collapsed in his office at the hotel of what turned out to be a cardiac arrhythmia, serious enough to require hospitalization and monitoring, but not immediately life-threatening. And the first call he made was not to his wife of 14 years, it was to Tiffany. And Tiffany called Naomi from Gerald's phone approximately 40 minutes after the collapse. 40 minutes during which Gerald had been attended to by paramedics and transported to Piedmont Atlanta Hospital and had apparently had sufficient clarity of mind to reach for his phone and make the call that he made. Naomi has told me that she does not know with certainty whether Gerald made a conscious decision to call Tiffany first, or whether in the specific disorientation of a medical emergency his hand simply went to the name that had become the most practiced destination on his phone over the previous 3 years. What she knows is that the call from Tiffany lasted approximately 90 seconds, and that when it was over she set down her compliance report and sat very still for 4 minutes, and then picked up her keys. She has described those 40 minutes between the collapse and Tiffany's call as the 40 minutes during which Gerald made his situation considerably more complicated than it had already been, because Naomi had been prepared to handle this situation entirely on her own timeline and in her own way, and Gerald had just handed her a piece of information she had not had before, which was the specific and undeniable clarity of knowing that in a moment of genuine crisis, in the moment when a person's defenses are down and their choices are purely instinctive, he had reached for someone other than her. That single piece of information did not change the plan she had been building for 8 months, but it confirmed with a completeness that nothing else could have provided that the plan was right, and that the timing she and Rochelle had been working toward had arrived. Naomi walked into Piedmont Atlanta Hospital at 7:23 on that Thursday evening, and she checked in at the front desk and was directed to the cardiac monitoring unit on the 4th floor, and she walked down that corridor with the specific, composed purpose of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and exactly what she is going to do when she gets there. The door to Gerald's room was partially open, and before she reached it, she could see through the partial opening that there was already someone in the room, a young woman seated in the chair beside Gerald's bed. Naomi stopped walking. She stood in the corridor outside her husband's hospital room, and she looked through the partial opening of the door at the young woman sitting beside her husband's bed, and she took one breath, and she made a decision, and she pushed the door open, and she walked in. Tiffany looked up when the door opened, and her expression went through several things in rapid succession. The first was surprise. The second was recognition, because Tiffany understood immediately who had just walked through the door. And the third was something that Naomi has described as genuine distress. Not the performed distress of someone who has been caught in a dramatic moment, but the specific distress of someone who has just understood in real time the full shape of something they had been choosing not to examine too carefully. Gerald looked at his wife from his hospital bed with the expression of a man who has just understood that 2 separate parts of his life that he had been managing carefully for 3 years have arrived in the same room at the same time, and that the management is permanently over. Naomi looked at her husband, and she looked at Tiffany, and she said nothing. She walked to the other side of the bed from where Tiffany was sitting, and she set down her bag, and she sat in the chair on her side of the bed, and she looked at Gerald, and she said, "How are you feeling?" Gerald said he was feeling better. Naomi nodded. She looked at the monitors beside his bed. She asked the nurse who came in shortly after about his condition and his medications and his expected discharge timeline, and she listened carefully to the answers and wrote the relevant information in the small notebook she always carried. Tiffany sat in the chair on the other side of the bed for approximately 20 minutes, and then she stood and said she should go, and Gerald looked at Naomi, and Naomi was writing something in her notebook, and Tiffany left the room, and the door closed behind her, and Gerald said, "Naomi." And Naomi looked up from the notebook, and she said, "You should rest," and that was all she said. They sat in that room together for 2 more hours with the television on low and the monitors beeping their steady rhythm, and Naomi asking appropriate questions about how he felt, and Gerald answering them carefully, and neither of them saying the thing that the room was completely and entirely full of. She drove home at 10:30, and she sat in her car in the hospital parking garage for approximately 15 minutes before she started the engine, and in those 15 minutes, she called Rochelle Foster, and she said 3 words. "It is time." Rochelle said, "I will have everything ready by Monday." Naomi said, "Thank you." And she started the engine, and she drove home, and she made herself a cup of tea, and she sat in the living room, where she had been reviewing her compliance report 3.5 hours earlier, and she stayed there for a long time, and she has told me that what she felt sitting in that living room was not triumph, and it was not the dramatic relief of someone who has finally been able to release something they have been holding. What she felt was the specific and complicated grief of someone who has known for 8 months that a marriage is over, and has spent those 8 months doing everything correctly, and has now arrived at the moment when doing everything correctly has produced the outcome it was always going to produce, and must now decide what to do with the rest of a life that is going to look very different from the one she thought she was building when she stood in that Midtown Atlanta venue on a warm May evening in 2009. She sat in that living room until midnight, and then she went to bed, and Gerald came home the following afternoon, and Naomi was warm and appropriate, and exactly the wife he believed her to be for one final evening, and the following Monday morning Rochelle Foster filed the paperwork, and by the time Gerald arrived at the hotel that morning, a process server was waiting in the lobby. The divorce settlement was reached in mediation 5 months later. Rochelle's preparation and Naomi's documentation had produced a picture of the marital estate that was thorough enough that Gerald's attorney advised him against contesting any of the significant asset divisions. The Buckhead home went to Naomi. The investment accounts were divided, with Naomi receiving the larger portion, reflecting her documented financial contributions over 14 years of marriage. The retirement accounts were divided equitably. Gerald retained his position at the hotel, but the settlement reflected 14 years of marital partnership in a way that his attorney had advised him was the best available outcome, given the completeness and the thoroughness of the documentation on the other side of the table. Naomi has told me that she did not feel that what she received was compensation for what had happened. She felt that what she received was what was always hers, and that the mediation process had simply made that fact legally visible and permanently recorded. She moved from the Buckhead home 4 months after the settlement was finalized, not because she had to, but because she chose to. She found a condominium in Virginia Highland that she chose entirely by herself and furnished according to her own preferences, without consulting anyone, and that contained nothing that required her to explain its presence to another person. Her mother Iris came from Decatur to help her move, and the two of them spent a Saturday afternoon arranging furniture and making tea and talking about things that had nothing to do with Gerald or the settlement or the hospital room. And that Saturday afternoon was exactly what Naomi needed, which was to be reminded that the life she was building was not defined by what had ended, but by what she was choosing to begin. Tiffany no longer works at the hotel. Naomi learned this from a mutual acquaintance several months after the settlement, and noted it the way she noted most things that happened on Gerald's side of what had occurred, briefly, and without significant emotional investment. Naomi Whitfield is 45 years old now, and she still works in corporate compliance, and she is better at her work than she was before the Thursday evening in November, because the 8 months between the Friday morning in March, when she found the credit card charge, and the Thursday evening in November, when she got the phone call, taught her something about herself that she had been applying professionally for years without fully understanding how completely it applied to her own life. She learned that the specific skill of noticing when something does not add up and following the trail and documenting what she found and positioning herself appropriately within the full picture of a situation was not a professional skill that lived only in her work. It was a quality that lived in her entirely. and that she could bring to bear on anything that required her full attention and her complete honesty about what she was seeing. She told me that the moment she thinks about most from those 8 months is not the hospital room, and it is not the day Rochelle filed the paperwork, and it is not the Saturday her mother helped her arrange furniture in Virginia Highland. The moment she thinks about most is the Friday morning in March when she found the credit card charge and looked at it for a long time, and then opened her laptop and followed the trail. Because that was the moment she decided to apply everything she knew to the most important situation of her life, and to be completely honest with herself about what she was finding, and every good thing that came after that decision came directly from it. Here is what stays with me about Naomi Whitfield. Gerald Whitfield spent 3 years in a marriage with a corporate compliance officer whose entire professional purpose was to notice when something that was supposed to add up did not add up, and to follow the trail until she understood what was actually there. And he spent those 3 years believing that the warmth and the presence and the normalcy of their home life meant that she was not running the same processes at home that she ran at work. Every single day, he was wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when they believe that love and professional capability occupy separate rooms in a person, and that access to one does not mean the other becomes available. Naomi loved Gerald, and she was also exceptionally good at her job, and those two things did not cancel each other out or exist in separate compartments. They operated simultaneously, and when the situation required it, she applied both of them together to the most important problem she had ever been asked to solve. The phone call on the Thursday evening in November did not start anything. It completed something that had already been underway for 8 months. Gerald thought he was calling for help when he reached for that phone in his office at the hotel. What he was actually doing in those 40 minutes before Tiffany called Naomi was confirming for his wife that the plan she had already been executing for 8 months was exactly right, and that the time she and her attorney had been carefully building toward had finally and unmistakably arrived. So here's what I want to ask you before you go. The first question is about the hospital room. Naomi walked in and saw Tiffany sitting in the chair beside her husband's bed, and she sat down on the other side, and she asked Gerald how he was feeling, and she spoke to the nurse, and she wrote things in her notebook, and when Gerald said her name, she said you should rest, and that was all. Do you think that was the right decision, or do you think there was something that needed to be said in that room that Naomi chose not to say? And the second question is about the 8 months. Naomi knew what she knew, and she sat across from Gerald at dinner and attended his hotel events as his wife, and was warm and present, and exactly the wife he believed her to be for 8 full months while she built her case. Do you think that kind of patience is a form of strength, or do you think there is something uncomfortable about the idea of performing a marriage you have already decided to leave? Drop your answers in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you think, and this story is going to start a conversation that is going to run for a very long time. If this story made you think about the quiet, observant people in your life who are always paying more attention than anyone around them realizes, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the like button if Naomi Whitfield reminded you of someone you know, and subscribe to Psyche Tales TV, because we are telling the stories that matter on this channel, and this community is growing every single day, and we are grateful for every single one of you who is here with us. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next one.